Good morning. Welcome to the Boardwalk Talks program at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab Aquarium. My name is Mendel Graber. I am one of the educators here at the lab. And this morning we're going to be chatting with Allison Fletcher about her work looking at the interplay between microplastics and heavy metals in the environment of Mobile Bay and potential impacts to animals if they ingest these compounds. So with that, I'm going to let Allison tell you about her project.
Thank you, Mendel. Hey everyone, thanks for joining me. I know everyone probably had a rough night last night, still waiting on the election results, but thanks for joining me today. And yeah, just an introduction to my project. This is an ongoing project that started as a capstone project in my master's degree, and I'm still doing some work on it in this lab. But first of all, what are microplastics? So plastics, they don't ever disappear completely. They just degrade and get smaller and smaller until you can't really see them with the naked eye anymore. And these particles are known as microplastics, and microplastics are less than 5 millimeters in diameter. And there are trillions of particles everywhere in the ocean, in the air. They just don't ever really go away. And also there are microfibers, and fibers are plastic fibers from fishing line, fishing rope, and then the number one source of fibers is actually your polyester clothing. So every time you wash your clothes in the washing machine, thousands of these synthetic plastic fibers are getting washed down the drain and into the ocean. And when animals ingest these particles, it can cause altered behavior, stress. It can cause starvation due to a false sense of fullness. They feel like their bellies are full, so they're not eating, and which can cause mortality. And then the other facet of my project is heavy metals. And heavy metals are naturally found everywhere in the environment, like copper, zinc, manganese, iron. And most animals, including ourselves, need a small amount of these metals in our bodies to survive. But high concentrations, too high of concentrations that animals can't, their bodies can't maintain, can cause liver damage, nerve damage, and mortality as well. And there's been an increase of heavy metals in the marine environment due to land use runoff, from factories, pollution, a lot of shipping traffic, from ships. A lot of paints in ships have copper and zinc in them. So how do these two interact? Well, in my title, I mentioned adsorption, and adsorption is absorbing something to the surface, not inside of it. So absorption would be microplastics absorbing metals inside of them. But this is metals adsorbing to the surface of microplastics so that they can be carried through the environment. They're easily transferable. Basically, plastics because of their charged surfaces, they become sticky, and so that's how the metal ions stick to the surface of plastics, and how animals can potentially be ingesting plastics with these metal concentrations on them, which leads to a multiple stressor effect. Now you have animals trying to get rid of plastic and high metal concentrations from their bodies, and basically larval fish, juvenile animals, animals found in estuaries and nurseries, they may be prone to ingesting more of these metals, and which may be causing a lot of damage. So there have been some studies, a lot of studies where metals are absorbing to the surface of microplastics, but these studies deal with just having a beaker of water of plastics and spiking them with metals and just see if they're absorbing. But I wanted to look more deeper into the mechanisms that might be causing this in nature. I wanted to see if metals are actually being transferred from the sediments to the plastics. And I also wanted to know if maybe fibers versus plastics make a difference, or if different sediment types actually make a difference in this adsorption process. So first I started with the plastics, and these are microplastics, and these are microfibers. These are just some of them. I sorted them out, and then the plastic fragments, these are all 1 to 4 millimeters in size. That way they're easily recognizable in my project. I don't have to use a microscope. And these were actually leached of their metals 7 times so that I could have like a baseline to go off of. So these are trace metal clean. They don't have any metals on them. And next...
Allison, can I ask you a quick question? Were those
Sure.
collected in the environment, or did you collect those somewhere else?
So these were actually given to me by Caitlin Wessel from NOAA, and these are from her 2016 study. She did collect these off the coast of Dauphin Island out here. So these actually were collected in the environment. They've been cleaned and confirmed that they are plastics. And then next, I wanted to decide what metals I wanted to look at. So these are the common metals found in the environment, and like I said, found in ships paint and things like that. These are also the metals that the ICP-MS, which I'll talk about in a little bit, that they measure. So that was the main thing we wanted to do, was we needed to decide what kind of metals we're looking at here. And for instance, cadmium is pretty toxic in high amounts to fish. And then aluminum is a terrestrial source. So if there's any aluminum in the environment, it came from land use runoff in the marine environment. And then, so next, I had to pick the sites that I wanted to get my sediments from. And these sites are from our Mobile Bay survey that we did last summer. I chose the sites that are colored in black. I wanted to do a river site and 2 bay sites. And then I wanted to make sure they had different types of sediment. So the river site is silt. This site is sandy, and this site's like sandy clay, and this site's more of just straight clay, and it's in the shipping channel. So once I chose those sites, we used the Ekman sediment grab off the boat to grab these sediments. You basically lower it into the water, and this has like closing mechanism. When it hits the bottom, it closes and locks, and then you pull it back up, and there's your sediment. Then once I got it, I had to freeze it, put it in the drying oven after it thawed out, and then we used this mortar and pestle to grind it. And this is basically what the sediments look like whenever you're done. This was a lot of painstaking labor grinding in this little mortar.
Why is the color different between the ones in the beaker and the ones in the sample bottle?
So the ones in the sample bottle were actually combusted, and that is simply basically anything organic was burned off of it. And that's so we can use this for grain analysis later on. But that's basically, like, when it's dried, it just looks like that.
So the darker color in the beaker reflects a lot of organic matter in that sample.
Right. The darker it is, the more rich in organic matter. This was actually from a site that had a lot of like oyster shells in it too.
So do you know what kind of mineral or rock compounds you have in there?
So we actually, this is mostly sandy clay, and then this is just clay, and then this is from the Mobile site, so it's like mostly silt with a mixture of some sand grains. And then we actually are still doing grain analysis, which actually just confirms what exactly is made up in there, like the percentage of sand versus clay and things like that. So then I did my experimental setup, and basically these are just 6 bottles per site that I mentioned. We put 6 fibers in 3 of the bottles and 6 plastics in 3 of the bottles, and then you add the sediments, and I used trace metal clean water, so it's pure water because I strictly just wanted to know what metals were being transferred from the sediments to the plastics. And these were shaken every 30 minutes for a couple of hours, and that's just a close-up. So once those are done after a couple hours, I basically retrieved the plastics, and I put the plastics in. This is a solution of ammonium nitrate, which extracts the metals. And then basically I end up with a solution that looks like this. And this is what I use to analyze on the ICP-MS, which is inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry. There's a lot of fancy words for basically a solution passes through this beautiful purple plasma light, and it separates the ions, and then it detects which metal comes from each ion.
So it doesn't take very long for the metals to absorb to the plastics then, just a couple of hours?
Right, within just a couple of hours. Some of it's like instantly. I mean, you just shake it and they're just immediately stick to it. And actually, I got pretty high concentrations on all the plastics just within a couple hours. So that means, in your shallow coastal and estuary type environments where you have like wave action and sediments being kicked up, it's possible that these metals could easily stick to these plastics, and then you have like larval fish eating them. And
so you mentioned a few minutes ago that estuaries are an important place to look for this kind of information, and that animals in estuaries may be more vulnerable to this process. Could you explain that a little bit?
So estuaries are used as nurseries for a lot of animals, and so that's where you'll find a lot of like larval crustaceans and larval fish, but also estuaries get a lot of fresh water and runoff from rivers, so they get a lot of pollution as well. And you have like in coastal areas of estuaries, you have a lot of high metal pollution, but you can also have a lot of microplastic pollution. So the animals, the nursery animals that hang around in this area are exposed to it a lot more often.
So they're exposed to it a lot more because of the runoff and the way these processes work, but also because they are of a size that might be targeting these particles, right? So
yeah.
Bigger animals may not necessarily be directly eating them. Do you know anything about how they may or may not move up the food chain?
Yes, so there hasn't been, so my study was mainly just if there's any differences between sediments and fibers that are absorbing more of these metals. But there's still a lot of research being done on how exactly this moves up the food chain. But yes, basically you start off with larval and nursery fish that are ingesting these plastics and metals. And then, of course, they're getting eaten by larger animals, and the metals and plastics are accumulating in their bodies and their tissues, and then those larger animals eat those. And so the further you move up the food chain, you have more metal concentrations and plastics accumulating.
What about oysters? Oysters are filter feeders in some of these areas, and if the sediment's kicked up and they're filtering those sediments, can that be an issue as well?
Yes, definitely can be an issue. They could be accumulating a lot of this metal pollution too, and maybe even microplastic particles that are literally so tiny you can't see or notice could also be accumulating. And also, so I just wanted to show a couple of the basic figures I found, like for iron and for nickel. You can clearly see, so the blue is fibers and the red is plastics. So you can clearly see there's a difference, and these fibers are adsorbing metals a lot more to their surface than the regular plastics, which is not good because fibers are the number one source of plastics in the water. You can also see across sites, depending on the type of sediment, we found a significant difference in concentrations of metals. But it's also element specific, so it may just depend on what element is more abundant in a certain environment. Like in Mobile Bay, we have more iron and manganese, and iron was absorbed a lot to the fibers.
So what's the danger of iron and nickel in our foods, and as those being heavy metals? Is there a danger?
There is a danger to smaller organisms when you have concentrations that go beyond their threshold, beyond more than what their body can get rid of. As far as people go, there may not be as much of a danger because our bodies are able to really maintain a lot more.
So these metals and understanding how they're absorbed through the microplastics could change the population dynamics of a species depending on how they're absorbed?
Like,
is that a possibility?
It could be. Like I said, there's still a lot that we don't exactly understand. That's why this work it's the beginnings of work, but it's really important for being able to do future research, because there's just, these processes are so complex. There's still a lot we just don't know.
So it's stepping stones.
Right.
Before you can do this one, you have to do the other one. And so you're doing an important stepping stone in research of larval animals and heavy metals and microplastics and how it all works together.
Right. As far as I know, this is the only study that deals with just sediments transferring metals to plastics in the natural environment. So definitely this is future work that could be used in multiple studies.
To compare this to a couple of things that people are a little more familiar with, mercury is a heavy metal that a lot of people are familiar with, and familiar with some of the potential impacts of mercury. So another process that has been more thoroughly researched and understood, as Allison is explaining, that we're newly coming to understand these processes in the environment, and how human impacts are contributing to this, and what the potential impacts are. But to compare this to something that happened in the past that we understand better. For example, DDT was a pesticide that was in wide use, and it was applied to crops. The rainwater picked up the DDT, flushed it into streams where small organisms on stream bottoms picked it up as they were feeding. It moved up the food chain, magnifying with each step up the food chain, until it got to large fish-eating birds like bald eagles and osprey and brown pelicans. And the effect that had on those birds was that it made their eggshells very fragile, so that the eggs didn't, the hatchlings didn't survive to hatch, and so their population was decimated. So these processes do have the potential to change population structures. So at this point, there's still a lot of questions to be answered about microplastics, and not only the heavy metals that adsorb to the surfaces of the microplastics, but also bacteria. So there are other things that might attach to the surfaces of microplastics, and the plastic load in our waters is ever increasing, unfortunately. So this is some of the new processes, these kind of new processes that we're coming to understand through research like Allison's. So what else did you find with the, you haven't yet sort of sussed out the differences between the different sediments? Is that right? Is that like the next step, or have you already done that? So we did find that finer grain sediments, like clays that have more organic matter, that the samples with that sediment was adsorbing more metal concentrations to the plastic, which could be because there's just more metals in that sediment. But also for future work, I want to look at salinity and see, because this is just pure trace metal clean water that we use, but salinity can also play a big factor, and pH and things like that can play a big factor. So I would like to do more experiments dealing with that. And then, like you mentioned, the bacteria and what's called a biofilm that can grow on the plastics, like algae and bacteria, to see if that also plays a factor in these metal concentrations absorbing. Did you notice differences in the different locations of your samples?
We did notice that there was higher manganese and iron in the shipping channel, which there was a lot of higher metal concentrations in the shipping channel, which can be normal because that sediment is dredged and upturned a lot. And then we noticed that the Mobile site had the highest concentration of cadmium, and this is most likely due because of all the traffic and the pollution, and Mobile is like highly industrialized, and cadmium is one of the most toxic in high concentrations.
What does cadmium come from?
So it's basically, so it's this element right here, and I mean it is naturally found in the environment, but in high concentrations our bodies can't expel of it.
Could you give us a couple of examples of these different elements and where they come from, whether they're naturally occurring or, you know, how humans are contributing to the load of those metals in the environment?
So, yes, they are naturally occurring, but we're also contributing to them from like the coal ash plants that are on the Mobile River. And then, like I mentioned, most paint in ships, and it consists of copper and zinc. So, like in the Mobile River, there was high concentrations of copper and zinc, which is most likely can come from the paint from these ships. And then iron and manganese is naturally found in the Mobile Bay in high concentrations. Iron and manganese is used by organisms when oxygen is not present, so that they can respire. And since Mobile Bay also has hypoxic, which is low oxygen areas, iron and manganese would be present to be used.
This isn't unique to our area. When we talk about like the shipping paints and some of that of what we find, like other port cities could deal with these same issues as well, correct?
Right, correct. This can be typical anywhere. I mean, industrial pollution, microplastic pollution, it's seen everywhere in the environment.
Without the addition of the microplastics into this system, how would the organisms interact, or would they, with these heavy metals in the sediments?
So basically, you would have the metals would flux, like get kicked up from the sediment and into the water column, and they basically just interact with them from their food. They wouldn't have, microplastics also bringing these metals into them. It would just be in lower concentrations with their food that they eat and just in the water.
So the microplastics concentrate these heavy metals and potentially other compounds and sort of make them available. They expose animals to these higher concentrations of heavy metals that would ordinarily be sort of dissipated through the sediment.
Right. Ordinarily, they would just be deposited back into the sediment, like out of the water. And since microplastics do have these sticky surfaces, they cling. They have something to cling to.
And then the fish have it. It has a substance to it, so it's something to eat.
Right.
So it's something that not necessarily to eat. They're not seeking out the microplastics, but it's something that can get into their food.
Right.
So have you done any research on the effects to animals, anything that you're seeing in the environment, or has that not been done yet?
I have not personally done research. Like, I am at the low level of the study. There's still not a lot known yet about how it actually affects animals, but like these lower trophic level studies I'm doing, where it's just the chemical processes and the dealing with like larval animals, that's what I'm researching right now.
And to get a little personal with why you're doing what you're doing, why do you find interest in something? Like, what brought you to this interest of microplastics and heavy metals? There's an idea that you started with and now you're here. So what was kind of that path?
So I've wanted to do this since I was 9 years old, and microplastics became kind of like there's fads in science. You have like the mercury fad that was big in the 90s where everyone was just discovering all of this. Microplastics became kind of the fad when I was in undergrad, in college, and in high school. And that was because really we were discovering that, hey, these are everywhere and they're not going anywhere. They're basically in the water that you drink, and they found them in honey from like beehives. And so I've always just cared so much about the environment and animals, and microplastics just really piqued my interest. I went to several workshops about it, and I really just wanted to know more about them in the environment. The heavy metals kind of came about when I did an internship in this lab, and my advisor approached me saying that there was some literature about the interaction between metals and microplastics. So I really just started digging into that and piqued my interest.
And now you've started on a long path as far as the steps that can be taken to learn more.
Right.
Another important note about this being an important process to understand in estuary systems and the potential for that process to impact animals that live in estuaries is that a lot of the animals that live in estuaries move out of the estuary systems into the open ocean. So they live in the estuaries as juveniles, and then they grow larger and they move out. So there's a potential for them to transfer these chemicals, these metals, not just up the food chain, but also from one location to another. So out beyond the estuary system, right?
Right, and microplastics with metals can also be carried out of the estuary system. So there's been studies showing that they're vectors for metals in the open ocean as well. So this is not something that's just present in the estuary. It can be prevalent everywhere.
Do you have any idea why you saw the differences between the plastic fibers and the other plastic forms? Are they different plastic compounds, or was it related to the shape, or?
So yes, my guess was that because they're long and they are fibers, so they're more absorbent to things. That was pretty much my guess. That was my hypothesis. And like I said, this is some of the first research that's being done, so it's not really sure exactly. I also would like to look at the different types of plastic, like polystyrene is styrofoam, and I noticed that some of the styrofoam pieces had higher concentrations than just your regular like polyethylene plastic pieces. So that was another thing in the future I wanted to look at, because I do feel like plastic type might play a big role.
So is there anything else that you think is an important takeaway from this?
I think the main takeaway is there's still so much that we don't understand and don't know, but it's important to at least try and get some preliminary work like this done. That way we can at least try and inform managers and mitigate decisions in the future, whereas if we need to focus on a specific location that has a certain type of sediment, or if we need to focus on a specific plastic type that we maybe need to get rid of or use less. Also, there's work being done to try and get filters in washing machines to keep these fibers from decreasing washing machines, and this would just add to that need to mitigate these issues.
So you mentioned several industrial sources of some of these metals. Can you tell us a little bit about like the potential sources that are just non-point sources, like the people who are listening who are not necessarily associated with these industries, how they might be contributing, and with that understanding, how they might lessen their contribution to either the microplastics or pollution? contribution?
Right, so you have like waste treatment facilities where wastewater goes to be filtered and treated to go back into the environment. They're also wanting to try and put more filters into those facilities to keep plastics from getting back out in the environment. You have like coal ash production facilities that I mentioned earlier. And then you have like factories that release this into the air, and then it eventually dissipates back into the water sources. And then you have, like I said, all the ships and the shipping that comes through the traffic, that it leaches off there. You have, like I said, your clothing. There's thousands of synthetic fibers that come from this clothing that get into the water every time you wash. Your clothes, I mean, everything around us pretty much is made of some kind of plastic.
So maybe we could lessen our reliance on plastic, particularly plastic that is kind of a single use, but also like plastic clothing that is not, it doesn't last very long, or maybe just think about maybe lessening, like maybe using more natural fibers. That's, or just, reducing the number of clothing that that we're purchasing, probably more than we need. And then maybe there is potential to reverse engineer this process, so that this charge between the metals and the plastic, is there any potential to use that potential to sort of recover plastic using metals?
I don't want to say there's not potential.
Sort of like a magnet.
So, yeah. I don't want to say there's not potential, but like I said, the process is still not understood, so maybe there is potential one day, but we're not really sure right now.
Okay. Anything else that you'd like to add?
I don't think so, unless anybody has any questions.
Thanks for chatting with us this morning. I'll check real quick and see if we had any questions come in.
Allison, what year are you? Are you working on your Ph.D. or are you?
So I just started my first semester of my Ph.D. I was in the professional master's program, the marine conservation program, and this started as my capstone project. I had an internship in this lab, and my advisor pushed me about Ph.D., and I decided to stay in research. So.
All right. Well, thank you for chatting with us this morning and telling us about this interesting cutting-edge research. And thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you for our next Boardwalk Talk.